I'm here to thank you for coming, welcome you to the wonderful Mission Theater. Really appreciate you coming out here to celebrate the kickoff of Oregon Craft Beer Month. I'm just going to say a few brief words and then pass the mic along to our Executive Director, Brian Butension. A couple of people I'd like to thank. First, of course, the McMenamins organization for all their hard work and support. It's been a fantastic thing to have the team McMenamin step up and do things that celebrate our industry. It's such a founding piece of what we do, and it's still vital and wonderful. So thank you very much to Renee Rank and the rest of the McMenamins crew, and Jeff Cooley. This is our 8th year, and I wanted to say a brief thank you to the folks that got this idea going back almost a decade ago. They include Lisa Morrison, Brian Butension, Jim Parker, former director of the Guild, Chris Crabb, and then especially I want to raise a glass to, as always, to the great Don Younger of the Horse Brass Pub, who was the man who I remember being the most vociferous about that everybody else has got a week, we need a goddamn month. And that's kind of Don Younger to a T. So please raise a glass with me to cheer those folks, and particularly Don Younger. And thank you, Don, and hope you're looking down and enjoying what you helped create here. Cheers. All right, without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic along to Brian Butension, who's going to tell you a little bit about Oregon beer. And thank you, Brian. Here we go.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, McMenamins, for hosting this event once again. I just want to touch base a little bit about the industry. We currently have 175 breweries in 59 cities across Oregon, from Turner to 10 Mile, from Joseph to Ashland. Basically all 7 regions, the 7 regions of Oregon, we have breweries. Oregon is the first state to have where craft beer has been the largest beer segment in the United States, and that's been since October 2010. We're the first state to do this. It's good. As you might imagine, we have the highest percentage of dollars spent on craft beer in the United States. We have a city with more breweries than any other city on the planet, and that's Portland, Oregon. We also have a city where the number 4 thing to do behind going to restaurants, hiking, and shopping is visiting a brewery or doing their ale trail, and that's Bend, Oregon. We also have a city with 1 brewery for every 1,440 people. Does anybody want to guess what that city is? Hood River, that's right, Hood River, Oregon. We also have the largest all-craft beer festival in the United States, the Oregon Brewers Festival. Most importantly, and most directly tied to this event, we were the first state to do a beer week. We were the first state to do a beer month. So if you want to check us out and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, that's Oregon Craft Beer. If you are currently on your cell phone tweeting about this, you want to put the hashtag OCBM at the end. And if you're looking for your next Oregon Craft Beer Month event, either after this event tonight or an event after this, check out OregonCraftBeer.org. And I'd like to bring Jeff Cooley from McMenamins Breweries up to the stage to talk a little bit about the event from McMenamins this evening. Cheers.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight for a official kickoff of Oregon Craft Brew Month. Also a great event that we're hosting tonight, History Night. Tim Hills will be up here a little later talking about a lot of the rich history we also have here in Portland, Oregon for the craft beer movement. And we're trying to raise some money tonight as well for the Friends of the Lone Fir Cemetery, and in particular to restore the tomb of the Bottler brothers. Thank you for coming out for the toast. But I encourage you to really stick around. It's going to be a great night. There's going to be some really interesting things going on. And it's a really good cause that we're trying to raise some money here for. Also, we brought 2 special beers in the back of the room created by our wonderful and talented brewers at the Edgefield Brewery. Our City Pilsner and Steamship Common. Both of those beers are very rich in history as well. And Pilsner's being a lager style that was really popular here in the early era of brewing, and the Common is actually a hybrid lager style that was started here on the Pacific Northwest by Fritz Maytag at Anchor Brewing Company with their Anchor Steam. So if you get a chance, make your way back there. Once again, tonight is a half-night event, so half of everything we raise is going to be going to these people here at the Lone Fir Cemetery for a really good thing. And with that, I'd like to offer up a toast from everybody at Big Minimans to everybody who made it out tonight. Thank you very much. And we have another spokesperson, former Governor Barbara Roberts. I'd like to introduce her. Thank you, everybody. Thanks again. Here's Barbara.
It wasn't bad enough I had to get up on the stage with a little shortage of step there. Then I put on heels tonight, which I never do. That made it more complicated, but I didn't spill my beer. This is a rare event that brings together history, beer, and a pioneer cemetery. You don't get that combination very often. Oregon is honored to have a world-renowned pioneer cemetery that is listed on the National Register and recognized by National Geographic as one of the top 10 cemeteries in the world. But with that history comes responsibility. Many of Lone Fir Cemetery's headstones and tombs are in decay, and the stories of those buried there are in jeopardy of being forgotten forever. Such was the likely fate of a dilapidated tomb at Lone Fir Cemetery that housed the remains of one of Oregon's brewing pioneers. The tomb of George Frederick Bottler was one of those decaying structures. Fred was interred there in 1865 at the request of his brother, George Bottler. Inside the tomb is a 6-foot marble slab that reads, "Gently, his ashes shall rest." This tomb, now crumbling, is the oldest part of Lone Fir Cemetery, is one of the first structures built in that cemetery. It paints a picture, when you read the information, it paints a picture of 2 pioneer brothers who arrived in Oregon in 1857. That's before Oregon's statehood. They established City Brewery and helped lay the foundation that has made Oregon America's brew capital of the nation. Tim Hills of McMenamins was the first person to bring to light the story of the 2 brewing brothers. 157 years ago, the Bottler brothers shared the same vision in brewing that so many Oregon craft beer brewers feel today. Brewing the best beer possible and enthusiastically and proudly sharing it with their customers. It was so then, it is so now. This vision and this history need to be remembered and cared for. And now we have an opportunity to honor the bottler's brewing history. We're developing what I think of as a team of supporters to restore this wonderful bottler tune. Our Lorana for the Oregon Brewers Festival, the McMinimans team, and that's a broad team, Friends of Lone Fir, the list goes on and on. New supporters are being added every day to make sure this tomb is restored and saved. Governor Victor Atiyeh and I co-chair the Lone Fir Foundation Advisory, and we are excited now to believe that we can actually raise the funds to restore and preserve the Bottler tomb. Those brothers made history. Our job is to save that history for Oregon and for the craft beer industry of our state. So I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, for eating and drinking. Keep doing that. It helps raise the money. And how important it is to benefit the Lone Fir Foundation and the Bottler tomb restoration. So let me now read I'm going to read this because I wrote it and I want to try to make it rhyme. Okay, wrong side of the card, damn. Okay. Lift a glass to them that brews it. Lift a bottle to them that drinks. Add a lemon for those that names the brew. Then add your songs and winks. Yet remember the pioneers who started this craft. They lay in yonder tomb. Add your dollars and change to honor their names, and we'll toast on the next full moon.
Hey, good evening, everyone. So now that the governor's done, we figured out how to work our own spotlights. Just so I can have one. Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. And we do have a lot more going on after these toasts. We have a couple of history presentations coming up later on. And after the presentations, we have a screening of OPB's Oregon Experience of Beervana, which was a great thing that Beth Harrington did for OPB. And we hope you'll stay here long enough to watch that. How many people have already seen it at least once? Geez, not that many. Okay, well, I guess you'll be staying to see it, right? And please don't forget, as the governor said, half of everything that is purchased tonight as far as food and beverage goes to the effort to rebuild, restore, refurbish the George Bottler Mausoleum over at Lone Fir. And so with that, I'd like to bring up Rachel Fox from Metro Cemeteries, who has spearheaded the movement to raise funds and to ensure that the mausoleum is restored. So please welcome Rachel Fox.
Thank you, everyone. I don't know. I'm Rachel Fox. I work for Metro, and I don't necessarily know if I need the credit for being the one to spearhead the efforts to fundraise for the Bottler tomb. I would say that would go to the Friends of Lone Fir and the Lone Fir Cemetery Foundation, and they're two wonderful groups of volunteers that are dedicated to preserving a cultural resource that the whole entire state of Oregon enjoys. Lone Fir is a special place that not only has brewers, we have suffragists, we have territorial governors, and basically the people that help build the state. My involvement with the Bottler Tomb began right when I started managing Metro cemeteries. And I remember the day pretty well. I was asked to put together a budget, what we call an ad package in government terms, but I was asked to put together a package of projects that needed to be funded. And I decided that the Bottler Tomb needed funding. It's in sad state. If you haven't seen the photographs, you should go online and look. Go to the Friends of Lone Fir Cemetery website, or go to Lone Fir Cemetery's Facebook page. It's crumbling. It's very sad that his story was forgotten, the story of these two brothers. And so I asked for funds to create a plan. And we hired an architect because the building's falling apart. So the cemetery is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's not easy to just go fix something. You have to follow kind of a protocol and do what's right, and preserve things with integrity, and to make sure that the structure looks as it was intended to. So we hired a man named Robert Dortnack. He's a preservationist, he's an architect, and he created a plan. Well, the plan called for $80,000 in repair. And Metro doesn't have those kind of funds. There's 25,000 people buried in Lone Fir Cemetery, just in southeast Portland, 26th and Stark Street. People drive past it every day and probably don't realize that there's 25,000 people buried there. And we can't care for every pioneer grave that's been forgotten. So we had a plan, but we needed money. And so I started working with Becky Oswald with the Friends of Lone Fir, Michael and Katie Blazer with the Friends of Lone Fir, Frank Schaefer, who's the chair of the Friends of Lone Fir, Perry Muhich over here, who you're going to hear from in a little bit, Tina Dippert. My staff started to volunteer their own time off of work along with me, and we would meet maybe twice a month, and after work we would all get together. Sometimes we would share beer, which made it funner, but actually it got in the way. It's hard to play when you're drinking. But we made a plan on making outreach. We knew the story, and really, I guess I need to back up. What's interesting about this story is Tim Hills. As I made the decision for the budget and asking for money for preservation of the tomb, did I get a call out of the blue from Tim Hills from McMenamins? And I thought it was kind of weird. What does this guy want? And he goes, Rachel, I've been doing research on early beer pioneers, and I want to talk to you about George Bottler. And I'm like, well, gosh, that's kind of funny, because I'm just wrapping up a preservation plan. I just asked for a bunch of money to create an architectural drawing of the site. That's when it really all started, is Tim networking with me, which is really what Lone Fir symbolizes out there, is serendipity. People come together, we don't really realize who each other is, and we all want to support that property. So I know this is long and boring, but it's a big deal in a regional government to have the faith of the Metro Council that would give funds to at least try to find a plan, and to bring in the community to be a part of the solution. Through all of this work, and working with Perry and Tim, did we find out that there are more brewers in Lone Fir. and which has been really exciting. And actually, even over the weekend, Tim emailed me. There's another brewer that we didn't know about, and maybe he started Portland Brewery. I don't know, but we'll find out because Tim's a really good researcher. Perry's been unearthing all the stories of people that are aligned with the Bottler brothers. And I know it's confusing. There's two Georges. There's George Michael. All right, from the 80s, people remember from the 80s. It's not the same George Michael. And then there's George Frederick. But they were brothers, and they were really tight, and they really liked beer. And they had some good friends, and together, everybody took care of one another. And I think that's what's representative here with the Guild, is that all of these brewers, you might not be related to each other, but you take care of each other, and you share stories, and you hang out together, and you watch out for one another. Even though you might be a competitor in your craft and what you're doing in your businesses, it was the same way back in the 1800s. So Lone Fir, we're unveiling these stories of these pioneer brewers, and I suspect we'll just keep unveiling more and more brewers that are there. So your support tonight, the support of McMenamins, is so important to unveil these stories of craft brewing, to restore the tomb of the Bottler brothers. The Oregon Brewers Festival, for instance, they've stepped up. Art Lawrence, who leads up that festival, has pledged $10,000 from the festival to the restoration of this tomb. It only gets us an area. When Art told me that, he said, I can't remember exactly how he put it, but he said, I have a tip cup for a $10,000 tip cup, and I didn't understand what he meant. I was picturing $10,000 one at a time dollar bills in a tip cup. But then it clicked with me, and it was the first time that I realized the support that the cemetery has from the community, and I was speechless. I think Marcus Lee, who's with the Lone Fir Foundation, whispered in my ear, Rachel, it's a good thing. Oh, okay, all right, thank you. Remember to thank the person. But so, you know, those stories are old. Those stories have been forgotten. And now people are stepping up to the plate, and they're taking responsibility. The community's taking responsibility for a community asset, for a cultural asset that tells the story of Oregon. And that's really important. A lot of people don't think that about cemeteries, but it's true. Cemeteries are the storybook of our communities. And so it's really important, and I really am so appreciative of everyone being here tonight. And I really don't have a good toast. I didn't think about one. I'm actually doing this on the fly. All I can say is I'm a good German. I was brought up around beer. I remember drinking beer out of Dixie cups when I was little. And my family actually does the ziggy zaggy, oi, 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 kind of toast. And they're German, they still speak German, but beer is a part of life, and as much as food and sharing drink. And so that's my toast. And thank you all for coming. Thank you. So I want to hear some ching, ching, ching. So next up, I would like to introduce Perry Muhich. And Perry's pretty special. Perry works for the same organization that I do. I work for Metro Regional Government, and we operate the Oregon Convention Center. Perry works for Metro, and she's the volunteer coordinator for the Convention Center. But in her spare time, she's one mean researcher. She is like history on steroids. This woman can find anything out about your family, and I think the Bottler family that's here tonight, and hopefully Perry can talk a little bit more about them, can attest to the fact that she's good at connecting history with the present. So I'd like to welcome up on the stage Perry Muhich.
So tonight I'm going to share some personal information with you about the Bottler family and the two gentlemen that the gentleman that's buried at Lone Fir and the brother that built the tomb. First of all, the Bottler brothers actually came from a town in Germany called Schillingswurst. The family business in Germany was brick making, but the beer brewing was also in their blood because their uncle, George Frederick Bottler, was the head brewer at the Schillingswurst Castle from 1833 to 1844. Now, you've heard a couple of times now that there were two brothers and both of their names were George. Well, Germans had a tradition of applying the same given name to several children as a way of honoring another relation. The child was distinguished by giving a second name different from those of any other siblings. As a genealogist and a social historian, this practice has been known to give me more than a few moments of hair-pulling frustration. And the Bottlers were no exception to this. Both brothers had the first name George. When we first started looking into the Bottler family, we thought there was maybe only one George, who was the brewer in Portland. But as research progressed, it seemed that there was a lot of contradicting information. So after weeks and months of tracking down records, it was discovered there was indeed two brothers. Both had the first name of George, and both were brewers, which made it even more complicated. One was in Portland, George Michael, born about 1830, and one was in the Dalles, George Frederick, born about 1834. From here forward, I'm going to call them George and Frederick, so that you don't get confused too. George came to America when he was about 6 years old. They arrived in 1837. He traveled to New York with his uncle, Ernest Bottler, and his family. There was Ernest's wife, Catherine, and 4 children. The children were Eva, Maria, John, and Michael. There was only 3 years difference in the ages of George and Michael, and they grew up thinking of each other as brothers. After arriving in New York, the Bottlers went to Cleveland, Ohio, where there was already a large German population. And we don't know for sure why they came to the United States. We do know that the Bottlers were a Lutheran family, and in the late 1830s and early 1840s, many Lutherans were coming to the United States to escape religious conflict. There also at that time was a high level of poverty in Germany because of the Napoleonic Wars, and there were actually societies that were providing one-way tickets to America for the poor. The idea being that in the long run it was cheaper than long-term subsidies. Sorry about that. So anyway, they wanted to get rid of them so they didn't have to pay for them, was what it boiled down to. Young men were also immigrating to escape being forced into the Prussian military service. So there are many reasons that were causing Germans to leave and come to America at that time. And why George came with his uncle instead of his own family, we don't know, and we may never know. George's uncle Ernest started a cooper shop and brought in another German man, Henry Halsenbacher, as a partner. Ernst Bottler, George's uncle, died in 1844, and Halsenbacher took over the business, and eventually he married Ernst's widow, Catherine. Halsenbacher was a heavy drinker and was known to hit his stepchildren. George's cousin Michael recalled to a newspaper reporter in 1929 that at about 1948, he and George left home and went to Indiana, where they opened their own cooper shop. If anyone doesn't know what cooper means, that's barrel making, but I'm sure all the beer drinkers know what cooper means. It has to do with making barrels to keep that beer in. They had their cooper business there until about 1855. Now, George's younger brother, Frederick, arrived in America about 1854 with another cousin. That cousin was Leonard Martin Bottler, and they went to California, where eventually Leonard Martin Bottler opened a brewery in Marysville. So see, beer really was in their blood. In 1856, George and his cousin Michael went to California, where Fred was, and went to visit Fred and their cousin Leonard. After several months in California, George, Fred, and Michael headed to Portland. They arrived in Portland sometime before December of 1857. By 1959, George was running the city brewery in Portland on Front Street near Steamship Landing. Now, according to the 1860 census, Fred was living in the Dalles and also owned a brewery. George was shown living in Portland with his cousin Michael and friend Edward Schrader. George owned the city brewery, his friend Schrader was running the city brewery saloon, and Michael was working as a cooper. Fred Bottler left to visit Germany in 1863, and at that time he appointed his brother George as his true and sufficient lawful attorney. After a few months, George, on behalf of his brother, sold the brewery in the Dalles to another man, George Krause. In August 1864, excuse me, George appointed his brother Frederick as his true and sufficient attorney as he was preparing for a trip to Germany. In April of 1865, while George was visiting Germany, his younger brother Fred died of consumption or tuberculosis. Fred had written his will the day before his dying, leaving everything to his brother George. George's friend, Edward Schrader, was one of the witnesses to Fred's will. George did not get back to America until July of 1865, so in his absence, his friends Schrader and Weinhardt arranged for the burial of his younger brother Fred. After George's return, he had a pink marble gravestone made for his brother's grave, and you heard it described earlier. He also purchased a lot for himself, intending to be buried next to his brother. George then had the tomb erected over both lots. George was very active in the Portland community. He was a member of the Portland Liederfall, a German male chorus club. He was a volunteer fireman for the Vigilante Hook and Ladder Company, number 1. He was a member of the German Benevolent Society and a member of the Harmony Lodge chapter of the Masons. Late in 1867, George again returned to Germany for a visit. While there, on March 23, 1868, George died in Munich. His friends in Portland learned of his death on the 12th of May in a letter from his brother, still living in Germany, saying that he had died from inflammation of the lungs, and his family buried him in his native country. When George had written his will, he named George Flanders, Henry Saxter, and Edward Schrader as executors of his estate, and Henry Weinhardt was a witness to that will. George's dear friend, Edward Schrader, who was one of the who was one of those mentioned in his will, died of a stroke in May of 1869 before George's will could be settled. And Edward Schrader is buried at Longford Cemetery, not far from his dear friend George. George's cousin, Michael, stayed in the Portland area, and in 1866 he married Isabel Wendless, and they raised 10 children here, including one named Mount Hood Bottler, who eventually became a boxer. And the family lore says he became a boxer because he had to learn to fight because of his name. Michael died in Portland in 1929 at the age of 92. He and his wife are buried at Riverview Cemetery. There are still lots of Michael Bottler's descendants living in the Portland area today. In fact, we have some of them here today. I know we have 2 back here. Could you guys stand up? Jennifer, to my left, came from Seattle, especially for this, and Suzanne lives in Vancouver. Are there any of the other Bottler descendants here? I've been told that some were coming, but I've never actually met them. Okay, maybe they'll be here a little later. But I have made contact with approximately 12 descendants from Michael Bottler, and we're already talking about maybe hosting a Bottler family reunion at the cemetery. Also, that's all I have on the Bottlers. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of the history, but I also wanted to have the members of Friends of Lone Fir and the Friends Foundation, if you guys are here, could you all stand up too? Margaret, Tina. He wants everybody from the Friends and the Foundation to come up. So this is our group of Friends of Lone Fir and the Friends of Lone Fir Foundation working hard to raise that $80,000 to restore this tomb. And besides tonight, half of everything you eat and drink tonight, going towards that, you can see we have a bottle back there that says Bucks for Bottler, and feel free to buy a beer for Bottler. And I just want to thank McMenamins for actually doing this for us tonight and helping us kick this off and get us going, and I hope you'll spread the word. Also, I want to make sure everyone knows that the first Saturday of every month, the Friends of Lone Fir has a walking tour. Oh, I'm sorry, the third Saturday of every month.
You got it wrong twice.
Okay, it's the second Saturday. The second Saturday of every month at 10 o'clock, we do have walking tours, historic walking tours, and we invite all of you to come out and learn about all the people, the great, interesting people that are buried at Lone Fir, see the beauty of the place, see the history, the art. It really is a gorgeous place. Thank you all.
That was great. Got the Lone Fir people up here along with the Bottler family. Hope we took a few photos. I wanted to say what Perry did to understand the Bottlers was a lot more than she conveyed. And it was more than I understood. So she was kind enough to say that, or not to say that. For the longest time, I did come across the Bottler family, and I'll tell you why. Because in my job, it's amazing. You know, Portland is still so small town in a lot of ways. And especially when you're looking at different properties 100 years ago and that kind of thing. But get this, the first registered nurse at the Masonic and Eastern Star Home in Forest Grove, which is now McMenamin's Grand Lodge, was Helen Bottler. And it was her great-grand-uncle, great-grand-uncles that were George and Fred Bottler. And she was telling me, she was 100 years old when I interviewed her. And she was talking about her uncles, you know, oh yeah, they ran the brewery. And her dad, her grandfather was the cooper that Perry was talking about. But for the longest time, I didn't figure it out. I could not figure out that there were two brewers in the family. It was really confusing. And I thought, you know, they kept referring to George Bottler. Of course, they were both named George, but the one who lived in Portland was a fireman. And I kept thinking, well, okay, so he's the fireman, and the other one is the brewer. Well, Perry figured out, no, dummy, they're both brewers. And so with the research she did in connecting back to their native country, their native home where they were born and raised, she found out a lot more details that is great for the Lone Fir Cemetery project, but also just to get the story straight. So please, another big hand for Perry for doing that. So now, if I could bring her up here, I'd like to ask Beth Harrington to come up. She's the director of Beervana, which will be screened later tonight. And we're always happy to have Beth. And, well, may I take this opportunity to have everyone join in to sing happy birthday to Beth? Come on. Happy birthday to you. Just like Marilyn Monroe, you know? anyway, I've known Beth for a while, and she's just always fun and always talented and always doing interesting things. So she's going to talk a bit about her movie, and hope you guys stay around for that.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you all for singing. That was very sweet. I just want to say quickly that Tim has been such an enormous help to me, and not only the Beervana project, as you might imagine, for someone who's a historian for McMenamins, but also from other projects I've been working on in the intervening years, and I'm very grateful for that and for his friendship and his beautiful singing, too. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the film before we show it later on tonight, because we'll be doing the presentation in between. But the film is a film that that I was asked to do by Oregon Public Broadcasting. I did a lot of work with them. In fact, Nadine Jelsing, who's the executive producer of Oregon Experience, the show on OPB, is here tonight. And Nadine came to me and asked me, this was in 2007, I believe, if I would do a film about beer. Sure, I'll do that. But I really couldn't claim to be somebody who knew a lot about the beer community, except that I went to places like McMenamins and Bridgeport and some of the local brew pubs, and never realized that there was this really rich history and that beer is really in the DNA of Portland. And so I was grateful for the opportunity. I have to say, that Saturday Night Live skit, baseball's been very, very good to me. Beer has been very, very good to me. And this community has been tremendous. You'd think that I had, cured cancer or something when I made this film, because people really got excited about it. And I was wined and dined by all kinds of wonderful people and treated very well and made friends with a lot of folks, some of whom were in this room, people like Fred Bowman, and I got to know all of the people who make the great beer that we have here in Portland. So it was a real treat to do it. I did tons of research, as you might imagine, and I hope that some of that is reflected in the film you'll see later on. So thanks a lot for having me.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me? I'm so loud to myself. I'd like to get started since we have so many things packed into the evening. Thank you. I want to welcome you to a very special Oregon Encyclopedia History Night with Tim Hills and Dr. Peter Cupp. My name is Amy Platt and I work for the Encyclopedia. First, I want to thank the Northwest Examiner and McMenamins for continuing to make these events every month available and free to the public. And I should also say how pleased we are to share the stage tonight with Friends of Lone Fir, OPB, and Governor Roberts. So thank you for coming to our History Night. For those of you who don't know us, the Oregon Encyclopedia is an online website on Oregon culture and history. It is primarily supported by the Oregon Historical Society in partnership with the Oregon Council of Teachers of English and Portland State University. We have published over 1,100 entries by over 500 authors so far. Some of those authors are in the audience tonight. And I want to tell you that we just recently published 2 excellent long entries, one on the Hudson's Bay Company and one on the Coast Highway, Highway 101, and both are excellent and have amazing photographs, the majority of which have come from the Oregon Historical Society Research Library. I want to tell you also that we are an authoritative history site, meaning that everything we publish is peer-reviewed and fact-checked. So we're not like Wikipedia, we are an authoritative publication. As well as being on the web, we also hold public programs every month here at Edgefield and also in Bend. So just to let you know, at Edgefield we'll be there on July 30th at 6:30. And we're going to present on We Are Not Tramp Sheepmen, which is about the Basque community in Oregon and Idaho. And that's presented by Kevin Hatfield. And then we're back here next month on August 5th at 7 o'clock for a program on the Bull Run Watershed. And that's by Scott Fernandez. So I hope you can join us then. But tonight we talk about one of the products that we make out of the Bull Run water, and that is beer. I am so pleased to present for the first part of the program my friend Tim Hills. He's the in-house historian for McMenamins. And if you have been to our programs before, you've heard me sing his praises. He is the public historian's best friend in this town. One of the things we admire about the McMenamins is their commitment to the historical integrity of their buildings. And before, when they buy a property, they go in and they research the history of not only that property, but the people in the community around the property. And we can see it in the themes and the art and the artifacts and all of their buildings. And Tim Hills is the man who does that, among other things. I mean, he is an amazing one-man show in many ways. He also makes possible all of the public programs that go around in their public history programs in their pubs. So, which is why I call him friend of the historian, because he provides these venues for us to present. And tonight he talks about something very dear to his heart, beer. So Tim, come on up.
Thanks, Amy. Well, good evening again. Is everyone having a good time? Beer and history, baby. So, I understand some more Butler family came in. Raise your hands if you're new to the event. I don't see any hands. Oh, there we are. Okay. Yay! To me, that's one of the greatest parts of this event, to bring the family back here, and thanks to Perry for making that happen too. I've been off and on whenever I have a chance digging into the history of Oregon's pioneer brewers. And in the last week or so, I've had to dig through about 15 years of notes to come up with this. It was very hard to figure out what to include and what to leave out. But essentially what I wanted to do is have the chance to talk about those early pioneer brewers from the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, who they were. You know, we all know Henry Weinhardt, but there were a lot of other people besides Henry. You know, and he was one guy, and there were a lot of other things going on. So I want to kind of shine a spotlight on the other folks, but also talk about how Henry got to where he did. You know, he worked, you know, it's interesting. When I first was putting together information about the Butler family and the two brothers, and I only thought one was a brewer, and I thought he was probably not treated fairly by Henry Weinhardt. And I was getting angry. Because I thought, Henry, damn it, you know, he got rich, he got wealthy, he got powerful, and he left behind the people who built his foundation. And as it turns out, I think that probably isn't true. I think through Perry's research and other stuff that has turned up, I think Henry was friends and partners with a number of these folks. They worked together, they helped each other out. And unfortunately, the Butlers both died pretty young. And they did build quite a foundation, and Henry was able to build his entire empire with the help of what they accomplished. So I think part of what we want to do tonight is recognize that the Butlers, within the context of these other pioneers, really did accomplish quite a bit and are responsible for the beer culture that we're enjoying today. And of course, what's really fun is, you know, in the last 30 years, McMenamins and the other microbrewers and Portland in general has, you know, a renaissance of what was everyday life for brewers back in the 1850s, 1860s, because it was such a local trade. So anyway, I'd like to talk about that, and also along the way correct a few things that I think were just along the way, mistakes were made. But I do want to pay tribute to books like Stanley Barron's Brewed in America, 1962, a fabulous book, if you can find it. But also Brewed in the Pacific Northwest, the Myers book, which, if you can find it, is a good book. And then Brewed in the Inland Empire, I believe, which is about Idaho and Montana, fantastic also. And there's, of course, been newer books since then. But anyway, they laid the foundation, and so based on that foundation, I was able to dig in with those leads and find a few things that kind of made the story a little more accurate in some places. So, first we'll start with this Oregonian article from 1861. This is great. The Pacific, a steamship, brought up a lot of California lager beer, which was to be placed on sale at a public house in this town. The home brewers got extremely indignant about that and exposed several kegs of lager opposite that steamship landing for gratuitous consumption. The drinkers about town availed themselves of the opportunity as long as they could hold a drop. That says a lot about Portland, I think. As today, we can brew our own, and it's better than anywhere else, right? Yes. All right, so let's go back to before Oregon was a state, and in some cases before Oregon was even a territory. This is a map showing the Oregon Territory. California is, of course, at the bottom, and then the Oregon country is up top, which encompasses Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and then, of course, Utah over this way. So a lot of the brewers that eventually came to Portland in Oregon, they made their way across the country. They were coming from the East Coast. Suddenly they're hearing about a gold rush in California, Sutter's Mill, 1848, and it brings so many people out there, so many men, so many single men, so many men who like beer after they're done working, that the brewers, and what's interesting is, it's not just brewers. There's different, if you read some of these history books about the brewing history books, they distinguish between what a brewer, the class of brewer that they are. There's the actual practical brewer, the brewing master, the laborer who helps out the brewers, and then there's the brewery owners. And I think what my sense is, after sifting through some of these records and people that we hold up as being some of the pioneers were maybe not the best brewers, but they were smart financial men. I think Henry Weinhardt was both. He was an exception. But we'll see a couple that certainly weren't practical brewers. They were just better businessmen. So anyway, there were opportunities out west. So it brought a lot of people here. All right, so we'll start off with one correction. All right, so help me with this, guys, okay? This has been held up as the first brewery in the Pacific Northwest, this photo. Henry Saxer's Liberty Brewery in Portland, opened in 1852. And we know from all the documentation that Saxer's Liberty Brewery was on First and Everett in Portland. Okay, look at the backdrop behind the brewery. You see the hillside going almost straight up? That can't be First and Everett. The brewery might have looked like that, but I'm pretty certain that that's not his brewery. Not at that location. Bullshit? Is that what I heard? Oh, okay. I thought I was already getting rowdy here. I'm ready for a fight, though. Also, just to continue, Henry Saxer has held up 1852 first brewery, Liberty Brewery, in the Pacific Northwest. All right, so here's something that I kind of stumbled across. This is an 1850 federal census for Oregon City. And of course you can't read this, so I'm safe, right? But this says, Ferdinand King, living in Oregon City, age 25. It says brewer, and that he was born in Germany. We know he was also in the Oregon Territorial, or enumerated in the Oregon Territorial Census of 1845, also in Oregon City. Being 25, he would have been, in 1850, he would have been 20 in 1845. Whether he was brewing or not in 1845, we don't know. By 1850, he was brewing. That was his occupation in Oregon City. We know nothing else. I've not been able to find anything else about Ferdinand King. So he may likely, as we'll see as we go through some more of these slides and tell some more of these stories, so many of the brewers came to this area and kept moving around from one place to another, looking for something secure, something successful, and most of them never found that. A lot of them quit the industry altogether and tried something else. You know, very few were successful at this, and especially it just never happened where a brewer came to one place out here and stayed for his entire career. So that's interesting, and you know, within that context, you know, we're talking about 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. Did you know in 1863, Idaho City, which was originally known as Bannock in Idaho, was bigger than Portland? And that just, it shows you about the boom and the bust and you know, how itinerant the population was, and how during the Civil War, it just, during that period, so much of the population either went back east or went to different communities, different states, different areas. So, you know, there was nothing secure at that point. People were following the boom towns or the mining towns, or you know, in the 1850s, you all know where Linton is, right? On the way out to Scappoose, that way, St. John's Bridge. That was vying for primacy over Portland at that time. It was, you know, closer to the ocean. It was a better port in some ways than Portland was. And that just goes to the point that, you know, the brewers and so many other men at that time were going from town to town to find the best situation. So I figure that's what Ferdinand King moved on to. So I do want to make the point here, too, that the brewers I'm talking about and the breweries that they established in the 1840s, 50s, 60s were not the first brewers in this area. Where were the first brewers in this area? Fort Vancouver, that's right. And we have somewhere in the audience, Greg Shine. There he is, Greg, way over there. Archaeologist from Fort Vancouver. This is his photo of reed beer bottles that they've excavated from the Fort Vancouver site. That's correct, right? Correct. And we're talking about 1820s. But I think the difference would be that was not a commercial operation. They were brewing for the men there within the fort, correct?
The reeds was imported, but they were experimenting in brewing by 1826.
Okay, so he said these were actually imported. Reed's was an imported beer, but they were experimenting at the fort with their own brewing. So anyway, a future program will have Greg explain all of this. Okay, so here are the first Oregon country breweries that I've been able to come up with. So I have Liberty Brewery up there with Henry Saxer in Portland. 1852 is the established date. I question that, and I'll go into that in a little bit. And we have the Portland Brewery, not Fred Bowman's brewery, not the Blitz family's brewery. This is one from 1852, maybe 54, by a British brewer. Then we had the Dellen Brewery in Stillicum, City Brewery in Walla Walla, Eagle Brewery in Jacksonville, Oregon, Vancouver Brewery in Vancouver, City Brewery in Portland, Oregon City Brewery in Oregon City, Orleans Brewery near Corvallis, and the Dalles Brewery in the Dalles. So I want to take a minute and talk about the locations where those breweries are, and that goes back to what we were talking about before. You have the Portland area breweries, which is where up-and-coming settlement is happening, right? Then you have Fort Vancouver, or the Vancouver Brewery, the Dalles Brewery, the Walla Walla Brewery, and the Stillicum Brewery. Those are all Fort Army towns. You go where the soldiers are. When they're off duty, they drink a lot of beer. And places like Jacksonville, a boom town, mining town, gold town, So those are the first breweries, as far as I can tell, that were in this area. So here's the Eagle Brewery down in Jacksonville. This is, the ad is from 1859. The first brewer in this brewery was apparently J.J. Holman, 1856. It was taken over by Joe Wetterer, about 1858. This is his ad with his partner, Conrad Meyer. Wetterer's daughter ended up at Edgefield at the Poor Farm. Great stories about her. She lived to be about 100, and she talked about her dad's brewing operation and living in Jacksonville at that time. Okay, so this is hard to read, but this is the 1860 census, a page of it from the Dalles. And I just wanted to share with you, if I can read it. I don't think I'm going to be able to read it. This is one page where it has George Frederick Bottler, who was the brewer of the Dalles Brewery, opened in 1859. But it also has, living right next to him, his neighbors, teamster, someone who drove a wagon, prostitute, Methodist Episcopal clergyman, congregational clergyman, let's see, brewer, city, county clerk, and they're just, that's a little sample of what it's like to live in the Dalles in 1860, and you're right next to the fort, which is still active. So it was, a pretty earthy place. The other factor that's happening right at the same time is a revolution within the beer industry, and that's the rise of lager beer. And you have to realize, up until the 1840s, early 1840s, the only thing you could get in this country were English-style ales and stouts and porters, which are heavier, less carbonated, flat, higher alcohol content. They fill you up, get you drunk quicker. And suddenly the Germans are bringing over from their country lager beer, which is lighter, carbonated, hoppy, more flavorful. And, the argument was, well, it's less intoxicating. You can't get drunk when you drink lager. And the women like it too. You know, here's a case. This is Salem, Oregon. Did you all read it? A desperate affray occurred in a female lager beer saloon last night. A man who attempted to play upon the strings of a lager beer girl's guitar encountered a bottle of whiskey on his jaw. The bottle and the jaw were both broken. The man's wounds are considered very dangerous. So here's another ad on the same subject. This is from actually a Eugene paper, 1868, but it's talking about the Corvallis Brewery, and it says, this is pretty fun. The public are assured that I brew on the square and that everything in my line is pure. If you want fish berries and other poisonous compounds, don't buy of me. If you want a health-ensuring beverage, send along your orders, and you can then laugh and grow fat. So here's the argument about lager will intoxicate. And these are all local articles, but they're talking about, in this case, this is a debate going on all over the country. Does it intoxicate? Here's another long article, but this is in the legislature in Salem. And the senators are against lager, speaking against all of its negative qualities. The House, on the other hand, is quite for it. And they think it's just makes life better. So it's just this fun debate going on. But the flip side of this that becomes a problem for these German immigrants coming into this territory is it starts a reflection on them. And so these stereotypes start cropping up about Germans who are happy, fat, and drunk, basically. Here's another example of that here that came from the Oregonian in 1864. So you have, if I remember the statistics right, in 1850, Germans were only 1% of the population in Portland. There were only 8 of them. By 1860, I think they were about 7%, and there were about maybe 200 Germans. So they were a real minority that early on. And they really felt like a minority, I believe, when you see this kind of journalism and reporting going on. So that brings us to Portland. This is a view of Portland from East Portland, looking across the river to the west side, downtown now, 1858. And yeah, there's those statistics. Okay, but think about it. This is when the majority of the breweries I'm going to talk about were established and operating in Portland. It was just a backwater town, basically. And that's part of the story too, and what I brought up earlier is because opportunities to distribute their products was so restricted. Their railroads weren't here yet. And the wagon roads were almost impassable a lot of the year, except for the very best ones. And you had the water. A lot of things went by steamship. That was expensive. So the result is you have breweries who are serving their local neighborhood. And as a consequence, you have a brewery in all these different parts of town and in the next towns. It's kind of like today. It's the same kind of idea, except in that day and age, you did it out of necessity. Here's a map showing downtown where the earliest 3 breweries were in Portland. So we're looking at Southwest Portland, downtown, Old Town, and that main route going from the middle down to the left corner. Lower left corner is Burnside. Front Avenue up here on the right. And so Liberty Brewery is facing First and Everett. City Brewery is on Front and Cooch. Portland Brewery is on Front between Burnside and Ankeny. So here's our first guy, first brewer, Henry Saxer. It's always said he started his Liberty Brewery in 1852. Henry Saxer came from Switzerland. He was born and raised in Switzerland, came to the United States in 1850, and made his way from New York to Highland, Illinois, which is about 25 miles from St. Louis. And there he, the 1850 census shows him living in the household of Joe can't remember his last name, but he was also a Swiss brewer. There was a Swiss colony, essentially, in that area. But he was the earliest brewer in that area, in Highland. And it's interesting because in the census of 1850, Henry Saxer is shown as having no occupation while living there. So it's not known if he didn't know the brewing trade when he came over to the United States, and maybe he learned something from the brewmaster in Highland. Whether he worked as a practical brewer, I don't know. You have to go by what the record says, that says he didn't have an occupation at that time. So he comes across the country, and by all reports comes to Oregon in 1852. I can't find a record for him being here until 1855. So it makes me wonder if maybe there was some other place in Oregon where he was living to begin with, and then came to Portland in the mid part of the decade. Liberty Brewery, as far as I can tell from newspaper accounts, from deeds, did not exist until 1856. Here's one of the earliest ads for Liberty Brewery. And you notice he has a partner, Henry Saxer and Louis Behrens. And that's always the case with Saxer. He always has a brewer. And so that also makes me think he was the business guy. He was the financier. And he always had practical brewers who would do the work. So his practical brewer that he had in 1856 was Louis Behrens. The partnership lasted about 3 months. Behrens moved on. And Behrens moved to Oregon City, where he had been from the very early 1850s, which makes me think maybe he and Ferdinand King were actually working together. Just a supposition, but they would have been there about the same time. So anyway, for sure, Behrens leaves Liberty Brewery in late 1856, early 57, goes down to Oregon City and opens the first brewery there, the Oregon City Brewery. So here's the 1860 census
again, you probably can't read it, but Louis Barron's brewer, right in the middle there. Underneath in the circle within the next household is another brewer named A.W. Spielman, who ended up brewing over in Idaho a few years later. Louis Barron's, after about a decade, left Oregon City and went down to Eugene and opened the first brewery down in Eugene. And here's the ad from 1867, the Eugene City Brewery. It was on 9th and Olive. He died down in Eugene in 1871, I believe it was. So going back to the Liberty Brewery back in Portland and Saxor, okay, so Barron's has left. Suddenly, Henry Saxor has to regroup with his Liberty Brewery. It's hard to read in this article, but it says, Henry Saxor has secured the services of a thorough and competent brewer and has made arrangements to begin business again. So he had to get another brewer in order to continue his business. Again, it makes it sound like he wasn't the one doing the brewing. Okay, remember that photo I showed in the beginning of what's been called the Liberty Brewery for years? This is an actual sketch, a pen sketch, done in 1858 of the Saxor Liberty Brewery in Portland. It doesn't look that different, but it doesn't look that similar either to the photo, and certainly there's no big hill behind it. But this would have been what was at First and Everett in downtown Portland. So, you know, the breweries then and now, you know, a lot of breweries in Portland these days, you know, they have their own pubs that they can serve their product in. Back in the old days, these days, your main customers were in the saloons, so you had to keg up your beer and bring the kegs, deliver them to the various saloons in town. And of course in Portland there were all kinds of saloons. Some of these ads from the mid-1860s show. This is a fun ad. Again, back to the Liberty Brewery. This is 1861, and Saxor's decided, I'm done with brewing. He quits the business. He sells the business to his then brewer, Henry Ludwig. You can see in the ad at the bottom. And Henry Saxor takes off for Lewiston, Idaho, which didn't even exist at that point. They were building the roads to get to Lewiston in order to get to the gold mines. So it's interesting. I have to believe he was looking for big new opportunities over in Lewiston. He left Portland, left his established business here, and took off for what would become Lewiston. Henry Ludwig took over the business of the Liberty Brewery, and I want you to remember the ad up above, which is for the Oregon Bakery, and the proprietor, which is John Philippi, because we'll come across his name again. Henry Saxor came back from Lewiston about 2 years later and came back to Portland, bought more property. Actually, he didn't sell the property that the Liberty Brewery stood on. He just sold the business, so he still owned the property. But he bought some new property and he opened a wine business, and he was the first one to bring California wines into Portland. So Henry did make his mark that way too. So here's John Philippi, once a baker, now a brewer at the Liberty Brewery. However, because Saxor still owned the land that the brewery was on, Liberty Brewery had to move somewhere else. So they moved to the foot of Main Street, and it was taken over by Philippi for a while. Now, the whole idea of bakeries and brewers was not an unusual thing. You know, it's all about baking, right? I mean, I don't know much about brewing, but I can see the similarities. And so what happens over and over again is that the bakers become brewers and brewers become bakers, and here we have in Lewiston, Idaho, a bakery that has a bar in it. Look at the bottom. It says, a wedding cakes in any style. A good bar filled with choice liquors and lagers of our own brewing. And here we have the end of the Liberty Brewery. It's at that different address, but in 1871, John Filippi died, and the Liberty Brewery. So from maybe 1852 or maybe 1856 to 1871, that was its life. So now we come to another pioneer brewery in Portland, and that's the Portland Brewery. And this is an ad from 1854. It's basically a brewery and a kitchen sink. You know, everything is thrown in. We have a grocery store with all kinds of different things. It's like McMenamin's earliest breweries that were tucked into a closet or something like that. Does anyone remember the Cornelius Pass Roadhouse original brewery in the kitchen as we're trying to prepare other meals, working around the brewers? That's kind of this deal. That's my impression anyway. So Charles Barrett, this is interesting and significant. He was not German, he was British. He came from England and came to Portland about 1852 and may have started the brewery in 1852, which is significant because it's possible he was the earliest brewer in Portland, especially if the Liberty Brewery didn't open until 56. So Charles Barrett, he gave it a good try. He kept his brewery going for a few years, and then decided to throw it all away and go into the book business, and was a book dealer for the rest of his life in Portland. So the Portland Brewery, which was located on Front near, like I said, Burnside or Ankeny in that area, was really early serving, the English-style ales, and didn't succeed. And maybe he wasn't a good brewer, but maybe it was also an indication that the tastes were changing more towards lager beer at that time. All right, so now we go across the river into Vancouver. The Vancouver Brewery, another really early one, 1857, that was set up, of course, in the bustling town, not town, but the fort, just outside of the fort boundaries of Fort Vancouver. And it was located about on present day, I think it's 3rd in Washington, I believe, which is, the interstate took all that area out now, so it's hard to even realize where it might have been. But because of the meanders of the river, it was actually right on the riverbank. The brewery basically butted up to the riverbank. John Minich, as it's spelled here, in every record for him, his name changes. And I think it's because possibly his English wasn't very good. He was German. And his name was probably something like Menig, Minich. And you'll see in all these different ads, his name just continually changes, but it's the same guy. And from records, I mean, it's hard to tell because his name keeps changing, but there was a guy by this basic name that was in Oregon in the mid-1840s, so he could have been here really, really early. Anyway, 1857, he buys property from Esther Short. You're all probably familiar with Esther Short Park up in Vancouver, and it was her husband who had bought all the land, and he died, and she parceled out the land to Vancouver's earliest pioneers at that point. Oh, and I did want to point out, it was at his brewery that all these really notable brewers first worked. You had Henry Weinhardt, Henry Ludwig, who we met at the Liberty Brewery, but this is where he worked first. John Brown and Ernest Weisgerber. So John Brown apparently had worked in Salem and opened the first brewery in Salem probably in the early 60s. And so that would have been after he worked here. So he worked here in Vancouver, then went down to Salem and opened and ran breweries down there. This is great. He worked there in the early breweries for about 5, 6, 7 years. Then he moved up into Pacific County, kind of Oysterville area of Washington on the coast. Did a little saloon keeping there, crosses over into becoming a sailor, whatever that means. And then he becomes the lighthouse keeper for the, for the U.S. Lighthouse Service up in that area. Ernest Weisgerber went over to Lewiston, Idaho in 1862 and opened the first brewery in Idaho Territory after he left Vancouver. So quite a pedigree left this brewery. So here's our guy Henry. So Henry's story is, before he got to Vancouver, he had come to the United States, 1851, came to New York, and he had done his apprenticeship for brewery apprenticeship back in Germany. And he came to the United States and first got a job in Philadelphia. Then he went to Cincinnati. Then he went to St. Louis. Then he went to California. And this was a really common trend where you had these young brewers, again, looking for the best situation, trying to get experience, but also build up some money and eventually get your own brewery and build from there. So from St. Louis, he comes out to California, goes to San Francisco, goes to Sacramento, and then comes to Vancouver. The interesting thing is, as Perry found, the bottlers were down in those same areas. They were in Sacramento, perhaps San Francisco, and Wairika. Where was the other place? Marysville. So it's very possible that those guys would have met down in California. And they both, I don't know about all three of them. Some of them, Henry Weinhardt and one or two of the Butler brothers came up to Portland, or Vancouver, Portland at the same time, approximately the same time in 1857. Okay, and it's very possible too that Weinhardt would have met Minnick, the Vancouver brewery owner, back in Cincinnati. Because Minnick had ties back to Cincinnati. He was married in Cincinnati. Here's, again, it's just like that pen sketch of the Liberty Brewery. This is also 1858, the Vancouver Brewery in Vancouver. By this time, Henry Weinhardt owned it in 1858. Here's an ad for Weinhardt owning the Vancouver Brewery. But I wanted to get this. Okay, so here's Maney, a.k.a. Minnick, who had started the brewery. He went on to a bakery, and it's just part of that same trend. What's interesting, so Henry bought out Vancouver Brewery from Minnick, and it's said in different reports. There was an article in the Vancouver paper, 1868, so like 10 years later. And they were tearing down the old brewery, and they were lamenting that fact. And the newspaper reported that, it's sad to see this old building go, but for these two men, Minnick and Weinhardt, they made a fortune from this brewery. So apparently that's what was a stepping stone for Henry, and obviously a stepping stone for Minnick himself. Okay, but in the meanwhile, this is like an interlude. Henry Weinhardt starts at the Vancouver Brewery and helps Minnick set up a new brewery, the original Vancouver Brewery, in 1857. Later that year, he leaves that hoping he can have better success over in Portland. And he hooks up with George Butler, who he may have just met recently down in California. And they set up the City Brewery in Portland. And it was, as I showed in the map, it was on Front and near Cooch. Well, this didn't last long either. It's hard to tell what the truth is. Stories about Henry Weinhardt said he wasn't satisfied with the progress of the City Brewery, so he decided to dissolve the partnership and return to Vancouver. And you can see the date on the dissolution of the partnership is April 1858. So he goes back to Vancouver exactly at that time, and buys the Vancouver Brewery from Minnick. And he would stay in Vancouver for the next 4 years, running that brewery and building it up. And it's interesting. I wish we could see these. I don't know where they went, but Stanley Barron, in his book Brewed in the U.S. or Brewed in America, had access to Henry Weinhardt's day books and account books from 1858 and 59 when he was in Vancouver. And apparently at that time they were still owned by the brewery, Blitz Weinhardt. No one knows where they are anymore, unfortunately. But Barron quotes in that book that Weinhardt was doing such a big business at that time, and he was selling his product from Astoria just throughout the Northwest. And he was, he talks about Henry Ludwig working for him at that point at the Vancouver Brewery, and he was buying barley and hops from San Francisco, I believe, and he sold a percentage of them to George Butler at the time, who was setting up, or had already set up the City Brewery. And so it's a real interesting view into his business. Unfortunately, we can't look at it ourselves. We have to just take what's written about it. Meanwhile, George Butler, back in Portland, is continuing on his own the business of the City Brewery, and he's doing quite well for himself. And business is certainly booming for him too. So it's interesting, whether in reality, whether Henry Weinhardt and George Butler were really, this was their master plan. They were going to build up these breweries maybe in unison. I mean, Weinhardt is providing raw materials to Butler's brewery at that time, so maybe there was an unwritten partnership going on. George Butler did so well with his brewery, and he was so fed up with the annual spring floods before the seawall was built down on Front Avenue that in 1862 he took his whole business and moved it up the hill to 11th and 12th in Burnside. And he's the one who built this. This is Butler's City Brewery, the new one. He bought the land from John Cooch, and he laid this out and built the house for himself and built the brewery. And the other interesting thing, this is basically the same image, but it's a little clearer in some ways, and you can see the beer garden that he laid out. And this article ran in the paper Oregonian in the 1920s, I believe. And it's talking about all the memories that this beer garden had for, the old timers in Portland. And, of course, right now, that's where McMenamin's Ringler's Annex and the Crystal Hotel is, on 13th and Burnside. But that was a real gathering place for people at that time. And here's an image we were looking for, talking about the Butler Mausoleum. Here is a 1930s pen sketch of it at Lone Fir. And George Butler, again to be clear about this, George Butler, who was associated with the City Brewery and Henry Weinhardt as a partner, is not the man who's buried in the cemetery. It's his brother Fred Butler, whose first name was George. But as we'll see in just a minute, Fred Butler had his own brewery that he established early on out in the Dalles. But this is a great shot of the mausoleum that Brother George had built very lovingly for his brother Fred when he died in 1865. So that changed the course of Henry Weinhardt's path, because suddenly the Butler brothers, one had died, and George Butler, the one he had been associating with, I believe was tiring of the business, and he perhaps, I can't say why, maybe Curry has an idea, maybe the family has an idea, but he returned to Germany and was over there for some time, and the brewery, the new city brewery, was leased to Henry Weinhardt. But I'm on the wrong slide here. But before Henry leased that in 1864 from the Butlers, he expanded his Vancouver brewery business into Henry Saxer's old Liberty Brewery plant. Okay, so you may have heard that Henry Weinhardt bought out Henry Saxer's brewery. In fact, that's not true, because as we saw, the Liberty Brewery moved to a different location and kept the name and did quite well for a number of years. What Henry did was he actually bought the property, and he he expanded his business and opened another brewery that was under the same banner as his Vancouver brewery. So here's an ad for it. The Vancouver Brewery in Portland at the original address of the Liberty Brewery. All right, so now that brings us to Henry taking over the City Brewery. Now, do you see what Henry's doing? He's building an empire. And he's got the Vancouver Brewery downtown Portland. He's got the Vancouver Brewery in Vancouver. And he's got the new City Brewery up on the hill. And suddenly, his business is booming. Now get this for a statistic. From 1870 to 1875, Henry Weinhardt sold 40 to 50% of all the beer that was produced in Oregon. Wow is right. You know, and he kept, as he got the money, he kept building up his business, and he would add steam power to his brewery here. He would add new fermenters. He would add a new kiln, a new malt house. He just kept building and building, and his business kept getting bigger and bigger. And there's this great story when Henry died in 1904. A lot of his old friends were, remembering him and lamenting the loss. And they said, well, in fact, he was an old crusty guy. He wasn't really that friendly on the surface anyway. He was really big-hearted underneath, but you never saw that at first. And one of the great stories they told about him was, they said, he was all about business. Business was first, which, you see what he did, and I believe that's true. But they said, once he got his business done by like mid-afternoon, then he would say, okay, we're done, let's drink. So he did enjoy his own product. Just to follow a couple loose ends, Henry Ludwig started at the Vancouver Brewery, moved to the Liberty Brewery, Then he opened his own brewery in the Dalles. This is 1863. He opens the Columbia Brewery. He would have known Fred Bottler, who was George's brother, who had opened the Dalles Brewery in the Dalles in 1859. So Henry Ludwig joined him, not in the same operation, but a different one. He built this Columbia Brewery in 1863. We were talking about, I think Jeff Cooley was talking about one of the special beers they made, the Steamboat, which Steamboat Commons, that ties in with this kind of historical period. Steamboat Landing was across from the Butler Brewery, but also with Anchor Steam beer from San Francisco. Well, this San Francisco company called the Mason and Company, that was steam beer from the 1850s, was basically the first outside brewery to open and expand into Portland. And in 1865, they built and operated not just one, but two breweries. One was down on Macadam, called the Mason and Company Steam Brewery, and became the Oregon Steam Brewery. But in East Portland, they also built this brewery that was ale, porter, and triple X beer. This second brewery, the Macadam Brewery, lasted quite a while. This second brewery did not, and it went up for sale, and who bought it but Henry Ludwig. He gave up his Dalles Brewery and moved into East Portland, where he would stay the rest of his life with the East Portland Brewery. And it was basically, his brewery was down at, Washington and, I forget those street names, but 3rd and Washington, near the Morrison Bridge area. Ludwig was also responsible for opening the biggest, best beer garden you can imagine. This is from the grand opening in 1874 in East Portland, the East Portland Park. They have their own band, and they have shooting galleries and swings and all the beer you can drink. So Portland continued to grow, and they would have these little neighborhood breweries. This is one of them, the Philadelphia Brewery, opened right in that same area near the old Liberty and the City Brewery down on the waterfront. And this ran for several years, and many more would open in time. Not just on the waterfront, but they'd start moving up the hill like Butler and Weinhardt did with the City Brewery. And then just to end here, just to again shine a light on what Henry accomplished. This is a early, I think 1867 ad, and it just shows that he's expanding his business any way he can. He's not only making beer and buying the products he needs, but he's buying enough to supply the other brewers in town. And this is from, 1886, and this just shows the size and the growth of his brewery and the improvements he's making. Improvements during the past year, $100,000, including the ice machines, which alone cost $30,000. So again, he's just growing and growing. I mean, certainly by this point, he's the biggest brewery in the entire Northwest. And of course, it continues to grow, and here's a shot from 1908, and it really illustrates how big the plant is getting. One great story I wanted to end on. 1906, of course, the earthquake and fires down in San Francisco wipes out, everything. The city's just leveled and really hurting. And boy, could they use a beer, right? So brewers from down in San Francisco make arrangements with Henry Weinhardt. Actually, he's dead, but his company to help supply and make enough beer for the people who are still there in San Francisco. And you know the brew house that's still standing as part of the brewery blocks? It's, well, what street is that? That would be, I think it's 12th. That was built in 1907 just to make enough beer to sell and provide for San Francisco. There's a great article that was in the Oregonian from that time that goes into great detail about that. But pretty cool how those cities were connected at that point. Cheers! Thank you. Does anyone have some questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
When you were talking about the development, especially like in the late 60s with Weinhardt, what do they call their beer? What is the list?
Oh, well.
Label your beer and stuff.
Yeah, that's a good question. What was their brewery called? What was their beer called? Their beer label. It was always Weinhardt's Best Lager or something like that. Blitz did not come in. The Blitz family had started a latter-day Portland brewery, I believe in the early 1900s. And then during Prohibition, when all the breweries were hurting so bad, if they still existed, they had to get by making root beer and soft drinks and that kind of thing, or any way to live through those days. And Bill Wessinger, I had the chance to talk to him years ago, and he said the only way we could have survived, Weinhardt was ready just to go under. There was no way to stay in business. And they talked with the Blitz family, and they partnered during Prohibition and created Blitz Weinhardt. And together, the two merged companies were able to weather the rest of Prohibition. And of course, they did very well after Prohibition. So I don't know if that answers your question. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I was curious, where did you get their raw materials? Where did you get the barley and the hops?
That is a great question, and the next presenter, Peter Kopp, is going to go into great detail about that. I don't know much about that. I didn't really pay too much attention, but he will tell you everything you want to know. And if he doesn't, you can read about it in his forthcoming book. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yep.
In one of the advertisements,
but I was wondering why so many of the ads said, we'll trade for barley, but they seem to be able to get their other materials. Why was barley special?
That's another question for Peter. I don't know.
He already told me he doesn't know.
Oh! You're not supposed to say that. Yeah. There's a question up there?
Yeah, I have a question. In one of the advertisements you showed, there was, they were showing how much beer they could sell you, and one of the measurements was BBL. Is that for barrel?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Barrels, yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
This is not a beer question, but you were showing the census forms. I noticed it said free inhabitants.
Yes.
This was slavery state, but that was a requirement in your census, or I guess massive. Was that the slavery?
Well, also, Native Americans weren't considered fully inhabitants, yeah. Yeah, it is to look from this day and age, it is. That's a whole other story.
Do you know anything about George Norman and Lucky Walker's brewery in Vancouver, Washington?
Well, I don't know that name, but actually that was the first project I ever worked on when I came to Oregon, was the archaeological survey of that property in 1996 or so, and they were deciding what to do, whether there was any historical character left in that complex. But that name, is that one of the brewmasters there? Or?
No, he was extremely wealthy out of Vancouver, BC.
Oh, BC.
He owned it all.
Okay. Was he the last owner? Or?
George Dorgan, I don't know. Well, this is in the 40s and 50s.
So I'll make that tie. I mean, I can't come that far forward, but Henry Weinhardt sold the Vancouver Brewery in 1864 to a guy named Anton Young. And Young is the one who moved. He didn't stay in the old brewery, but he built a bigger one at the site that became Lucky Lager. And when they tore down the Lucky Lager complex, that original building from 1864 was in there. Yeah. Yes?
What do you consider you the granddaughter of Butler?
Oh yeah, Helen Butler. When did I? At least 10 years ago. Yeah. Yes?
So I've seen these old maps of where the Tanner Creek went, and it's always confusing is that the complex, the members are all from my member.
Oh, right.
It just occurred to me, but it looks like a brewery site, essentially on where Tanner Creek.
Right behind, yeah.
So was that a water source of beer?
That is a really good question. Probably.
Because it wasn't coming for those 23 years.
Yeah, that's right.
And the water might not have been very good without being beer, but it's beer that is safe.
Maybe that was one of the attractions to moving to that site. That's a good point. All right, well, thank you guys very much.
And now I'm so pleased to welcome Peter Cup to the stage. Peter's from here. He got his master's from Portland State University and his PhD from the University of Nevada, and he now teaches in New Mexico. He has authored several articles on Western history, and actually I have a list of them, and it's 3 pages long. So I'll skip it. And as Tim said, he's writing a book about Hoptopia. Perhaps most importantly, he is an author on the Oregon Encyclopedia. So I suggest you go on there and take a look. He has been so generous to share his research on the impact of hops on the economic, social, and cultural history of Oregon. So please join me in welcoming Peter.
This is like such a treat because, you know, I live in New Mexico now and it's really hot there. And I visit Portland and it's so hot. Thank you. This is actually a treat for another reason, which is this is my second talk at McMenamins. They brought me into the Baghdad Theater a few years ago in celebration of Oregon's 25th anniversary of the craft beer law. So that was a lot of fun. So I want to thank Amy and the Oregon Encyclopedia Project and Tim and McMenamins and the Lone Fir folks and all of the brewers that made this happen, that make this Nirvana, and maybe make this Hoptopia as well, as I'm going to suggest tonight. I also discovered something else important 3 years ago, which is I can drink during these talks. And when I went back to teaching classes, it was really frowned upon at 9 a.m. in the morning on Monday. And I tried to do the same thing. My talk this evening fits in with Tim's discussion on our region's early brewing history. This presentation draws from a book I'm writing called Hoptopia that looks at Oregon hop agriculture in the 19th century, follows it up to the present, and makes connections from around the world between farmers and brewers and scientists, all kinds of people. The book explains how and why hop growing emerged in the Willamette Valley, and perhaps explains why hops became Oregon's most important specialty crop over time. And I'll be honest, I have a very specific goal in writing this book, and that goal is this. I want to reconnect beer drinking today with its history, particularly its agricultural roots outside of the city. So that's what my talk's up to today. And before I forget, please keep drinking. As I promise it'll be a little more entertaining if you do so. So here's a little story I put together. I'm going to talk about 30, 40 minutes and drink beer. There is a magical place. There's a magical place. It sits at the confluence of the Willamette and the Columbia rivers. In between the Coast Range and the Cascades, in the midst of a temperate rainforest. It rains a lot in this place. And it was the long rainy seasons that drove scores of flanneled and Birkenstock wearing people indoors to drink beer. And in the last 30 years, we see a revolution, a craft beer revolution that caters to these thirsty people. And the craft beer revolution that begins in the mid-1980s was a revolution where brewers started to care about what they put in their beer. They started to care about the recipes, and they started to use a lot of hops in their beer, which is very, very important as well. So there's a pretty recent historical trend that I'm linking into by explaining the longer history of hop agriculture in the Willamette Valley. The place I'm talking about, of course, is Portland, Oregon. You've heard of this place. Its residents think that this name is not quite good enough, so they've renamed their city something far more sublime, Beervana, right? I live in Beervana, or I used to live in Beervana. You guys live in Beervana. And here we see beautiful Beervana. Since the mid-1980s, Portland, or Beervana, has been at the center of a craft beer revival in the United States. Bridgeport Brewing, it was called Columbia River Brewing at the time, was the first to set up shop, but then McMenamins, Portland Brewing, and Whitmere soon followed in the next year. Not only did the new craft beer culture create a fervent local following, but they started winning international awards for their beers. And by the early 1990s, which is a long time ago, right? Fred Eckert, a famous beer writer, dubbed Portland the craft beer capital of the world. And is the name that has solidified it, based on opening comments we've already heard, as Portland itself has over 50 breweries in the city alone, the most of any city on the planet, which is quite remarkable. This is a cool project as well, I forgot to mention. This is Mapping Beervana. If you just Google Mapping Beervana, you can see Whitmere and Portland Brewing and Bridgeport and all the various connections and the connections of the brewers that I was talking with Tim a couple of days ago. Brewers still bounce around from brewery to brewery, seeking their own utopia, I think. Well, I'm confident that many of you here tonight are familiar with the story of craft beer, or at least the porters and pilsners and ales that we're drinking. The story I want to tell, though, resides south of here in the Willamette Valley, which I believe is also another magical place. It's a magical agricultural place in that it serves all the needs for the ingredients of in beer making, and that, of course, is grain, water, and hops. I know you're familiar with the Willamette Valley here. Does it even show up? It's in the white, which is next to the other whitish-looking color. I don't have to tell you guys where the Willamette Valley is. Now, if you're a fan of craft beer, you'll know that hops are the essential ingredient and important to understanding this recent story. Hops are the linchpin of the brewer's trade, the spice of the brew. They provide distinct flavors, aromas, and they act as a natural preservative for beer as well, which is why they've been so important going back actually 1,000 years or so. Hops have been central to beer making. Believe it or not, the Pacific Northwest in the United States produces 1/3 of all hops in the world. Oregon, Washington, Idaho. 1/3 of all hops in the world. So that, of course, means that 1 in 3 beers in the world have essential ingredients from Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Okay? Now today, as many of you know, the Yakima Valley of Washington is the largest hop producing region in the U.S. It produces about a quarter of the world's hop supply. But the Willamette Valley is just as important in the past and present for their contributions to this specialty agriculture. Here's a close-up of the hops. I don't know if you can see, but the hop cones run top to bottom on these 20-foot trellises, and they're actually quite interesting. Has anybody been in Aurora or Marion County and seen the hops growing? Very cool. I know that some of you live next to them. Someone was telling me a story the other day. They were so curious what these hops were, they just went to and they picked, this was last year I guess, they picked the hop cone off and they just started eating it. I thought that was a pretty bad idea. The Willamette Valley was so important in hop growing that by the early 20th century, the early 1900s, insiders and outsiders alike dubbed the Willamette Valley the hop capital of the world, which is remarkable because this is 1 century before Fred Ecker's claim about Portland being the craft beer capital of the world. So these are the connections I'm trying to make in the book I'm writing. While not as evident in our historical memory as the craft brewing revolution, hops have played a crucial role in Portland and the Willamette Valley since subsistence farmers first planted them commercially 150 years ago. There was such a deep history of hop culture in Oregon that I propose the following. While we think of Portland and the metro area as Beervana, we ought to also extend that knowledge and that idea to the agricultural region of the Willamette Valley as a place called Hoptopia. And that's the title of the book I'm working on. In an age where we're becoming increasingly aware of agricultural production and local food movements, extending our knowledge of craft beer to the land is an important exercise. Folks, the contents of our pint glasses have a much richer history than you imagine. And seriously, if you're smelling hops in your beer, that has a history in itself. The smell of the hops and the taste of the beer is all part of this history. First things first. What are hops? Where do they come from? This is an image. For those of you that don't know, Rogue Brewery has recently purchased a farm. They purchased a farm in 2008 to start to grow some of their own hops. So if you have the Chateau Rogue beers, they're actually hops grown from an old hop farm that they acquired in 2008. The term hop refers to both the plant and the cone of the plant in the family. And yes, it's true, it's in the same family as marijuana. But you can't breed them, so don't try. These people ask me, so, hey man, can I grow a pot plant this tall? The answer is no. I think that was, no. There are 3 species of hops, but there's only one, Humulus lupulus L, common to Eurasia and North America that brewers covet. Hops are perennials, but they go dormant each year and they have annual bines that shoot up. Bines as opposed to vines with tendrils. To support the growth up to 20 feet these days, they require a deep root system that extends 15 feet in the ground. So if you can see these mature hops here, they actually have roots that go 15 feet in the ground. And that, of course, means that they need deep, fertile, and loose soils. And what I'm getting at here is that environment is essential to the story of Hoptopia. Hops only grow and produce well at latitudes 30 to 55 degrees on both sides of the equator. They need winter. They need a good winter for dormancy. They need wet springs. Have you heard of those? To initiate rapid growth. And they need dry summers to stave off pests and diseases like mildews and things like this. It's been a weird year this year already because I've been touring the hop fields this week and they got really excited about, so did you have some earlier weather that was sunny and then some rain? The hops are looking pretty good already, maybe ahead of their time. We'll see what that means though. So again, environmental conditions are key, and I'm going to come back to this point later. The hop only grows well in temperate regions of the world, and the Pacific Northwest, it happens to be one of the best regions to grow hops in the world. The value of hops resides in these inner yellow resin glands called lupulin. And it's a fun word to say, lupulin. Thank you. Lupulin, yeah, that's right. Very good. Lupulin, I kind of like that. These yellow pockets are what provide the aromatic and the bittering qualities and also act as the natural preservative in beer. They also actually act as a head stabilizer as well, that I didn't mention earlier. Brewers in Western Europe, actually Bavaria or modern-day Germany, first discovered the value of using hops, and historians have actually documented 200 other types of herbs or spices added to beer prior to hops. But it was the hop by the 9th century that brewers coveted because it could do so many different things for the beer. And so from the 9th century onward, hop growing spread from Bavaria to to Bohemia, to France, eventually to Scandinavia and Russia, all within a couple hundred years. The hop was the essential ingredient for brewers. And the hop arrives to, let me take a step back. As European cultures then colonized the rest of the world, they brought with them a brewing culture, and that brewing culture had hop cemented as an essential ingredient. So then the European hop varieties start to colonize the rest of the world as well. And this is really important because by the 1620s in Massachusetts, some of the first migrants to New England had with them beer and hop plants. So they were already planting hops by the 1620s in New England. And folks up and down the Atlantic seaboard continued to raise hops, mostly on the household level throughout the next couple centuries. And then a commercial hop crop emerges in New York and New England by the early 1800s. So the point I'm trying to make here is there's a transatlantic or global exchange that Hoptopia here in the Willamette Valley has built upon over the process of over 1,000 years. Let's see. How about a drink? I'm very serious. I got in trouble at 9 a.m. on U.S. history classes. So I was just talking with Greg Shine, who's moved around. There he is. Who mentioned that there was attempts to grow hops at Fort Vancouver, the HBC, Hudson's Bay Company. And I don't know much about this, so this is really like, I need to do some more research. But I will say that the research I've done indicates that by 1850, in the new territory of Oregon, the census noted the territory of Oregon had 8 pounds of hops. 8 pounds. The census of 1860 then suggested there's about 500 pounds of hops in the new state of Oregon, right? 1859, is that right? Okay, and all this is occurring, and it's really important because, as Tim suggested, this is also the same time that we see the emergence of lager beer. Lager beer was seen as an important alternative to harder spirits. There's a prohibition movement, if you didn't know, in the United States by the 1830s. There's a famous book called The Alcoholic Republic that explained beer was the answer to harder spirits. And it's quite serious. And so these ads that Tim had up of people can drink dozens and dozens of beers, this was all, this was the same argument from the 1830s to the 1930s after Prohibition. Larry Smith drank 55 gallons of beer today. He didn't stumble once. There's a problem though, okay? There's a problem because brewers here in the 1850s and the early 1860s, remember there's not even a transcontinental railroad to San Francisco until 1869. There's a problem because brewers that have learned their craft in Germany or England, they relied on hop varieties from Europe, okay? And in the far west, there just wasn't this supply of specialty agriculture that people needed. And it had to be tremendously frustrating, actually. And this is what starts the Pacific Northwest hop industry. In the spring of 1866, a brewer in Olympia, Washington, his name was Isaac Wood. His neighbors called him Uncle Isaac, and you can too. He approached a local farming family, the Meeker family, which might sound familiar to some of you, particularly those of you from Washington State. Seeking a fix for his expanding business, Isaac Wood acquired some English hop rootstock and asked the Meekers to plant this. They obliged, and all were quite pleased with the results. The Meekers earned $150 for that crop, which was really just a startup crop, which is more than most of their other agricultural produce. And from that point onward, they said, hey, we can sell this stuff. And they did. Ezra Meeker became a champion of the hop industry by the early 1870s, even by the late 1860s. And he noted that the future of Pacific Northwest farming resided in hops. Okay? So this is all occurring during intense discussion of when the brewers are emerging in Portland and Oregon. Here's an image we already saw. Here's an image of Ezra Meeker. Those of you from Washington State will remember Ezra as the pioneer, the face of the pioneer movement in the early 20th century. But he was actually the first king of hop, as I like to say here. Yes, that's an allusion to Michael Jackson. It's not that funny, but thank you for laughing. Following Meeker's success, hop cultivation in the Pacific Northwest spread rapidly. In the Willamette Valley, William Wells and Adam Weisner of Buena Vista in Polk County planted the first English rootstock in 1867. So it's literally within a year of the Meekers. Their efforts ended in failure, but they inspired neighbors to continue the activity. 2 years later, with rootstock acquired from these folks, George Leisure of Lane County on the McKenzie River, go Ducks, reaped Oregon's first commercial hop harvest. In the following decade, J.W. Kunoff, George E. May, and Alexander Seavey also became hop growers of note. And the Seavey family, some of you might recognize if you've been in Benson County, continued to grow hops and would be a major presence into the mid-20th century. The success of the hop growers was, as I alluded to earlier, the product of ideal environmental conditions. Here's an image. This is early 20th century. You can't see it too well, but here we are on the Willamette River, and you can see the hop fields back there. Hops grew on bottomlands, and they were just really well irrigated, and that was a key part, along with the climate here. Not only did the soil, climate, and ability to irrigate aid in hop growing, but largely virgin soils, meaning they hadn't been under intense cultivation for a long time, helped in the productivity of hop growing in the Pacific Northwest, and particularly the Willamette Valley. The environmental conditions also proved beneficial because there were not European or Eastern North American pests or diseases that came to the hop crops at this point in time. Thus, in 1873, the Oregonian reported that yields of the Willamette Valley topped 2,000 pounds per acre, which was twice as much as you could get in Germany at the time, for example. And in 1 year at least, George Leisure, who I mentioned was one of the first successful hop growers on the McKenzie River, he produced 3,000 pounds per acre, or 3 times as much as you could acquire from continental Europe or England at the time. As this news spread, acreage in the region multiplied substantially. Okay, so here is a major environmental part of the story. At this point, the question emerges, how did farmers learn to grow hops, a crop they'd never grown before? We'll turn again to Meeker for this one. A large portion of the credit actually goes to Ezra Meeker. Here's the letterhead of his hop company, who really did entrench himself as the king of hops in the far west. He spent a ton of time reading all available literature out there, and he went to Europe and back several times, and to the East Coast and back, to acquire information. Because he had two goals in doing this. Number one, he wanted to improve the quality of his crops and improve his marketing infrastructure. But also, like Henry Weinhard, he was trying to sell whatever he could to other folks too. So he was selling rootstock, he was selling the materials needed to make kiln dryers. He even gave farmers loans to start their own hop farms as well, with the idea that improving the reputation of Pacific Northwest agriculture would be beneficial for not just him, but everyone. Or I should say the other way around. Would be beneficial for everybody else, but mostly him. He continued to engage in what we call the knowledge exchange when he wrote a book in the 1880s called Hop Culture in the United States. That was a synthesis of other materials and then specific to the Pacific Northwest. Over time, by the end of the late 19th century, other farmers also published guides, and the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, also stepped in by the 1890s to help hop growers. So this was, again, part of a knowledge exchange. How do farmers acquire knowledge? They go and find it, and they share it among themselves. Here's his book, Hop Culture in the United States. Really good reading, really good summer reading. I think I've read it 3 or 4 times, and it's just really good reading. Of course, ideal environmental conditions and knowledge exchange could only serve the Oregon hop farmers so much. They also needed economic opportunity. And that's what happens in 1882, when there is a global hop shortage. 1882 marked a year of horrible weather in Europe, and they had their worst agricultural outputs of the late 19th century, including hops. Additionally, there was pests and disease problems in eastern North America, and this opened up an opportunity for Meeker and his fellow hop growers to seize, and they did. And so for the first time, the world turns their attention to the Pacific Northwest, not just the Weinhards, but everybody across the world, Latin America, Asia, Europe, are turning to the Pacific Northwest to meet their hop needs. And so the hop crops expand into the late 19th century, with the Willamette Valley becoming the central point of hop cultivation, the leader by the 1890s. That expansion left a footprint on the land, and we have a pretty cool photographic record of how hop growing changed the land. Here we see Benton County. These are from the Benton County Historical Society, these images. We see some workers in the hop yard, but you can see the timber posts behind them. That's how they grow hops. They would train them to timber posts. They're only about 10 or 12 feet before they moved to a trellis system that's more common today in the early 20th century. But there's all kinds of records of the changes in the physical environment that are pretty cool. Another important part that is missing on the landscape today were the development of hop dryers, where they would have kilns underneath and then spread the hops on top and dry them so that they could ship them later. In England, of course, these were called oast houses, which is really important for your next crossword puzzle. Oast. 4 points. Farmers planted more and more hops, constructed more and more kilns, and rode the ups and downs of the marketplace, despite the economic depression of the 1890s that left many in ruins, including one Ezra Meeker, who lost everything because he had loaned so much money to farmers. He lost it all. What does he do? What's that? I can't hear you, but great ideas. He goes off to the Yukon to look for gold. Of course. He fails in that, so then he becomes the pioneer of the Oregon Trail. That's right? That's what he does up until he dies in the 1820s. He becomes the face of the pioneer movement. I don't have an image of him with his famous gear on. Okay, so by this point in time, by the 1890s, the Willamette Valley is now the center of hop growing. The Yakima Valley doesn't emerge again really until the 1930s, 1940s, and 50s when they have irrigation there. That's why the Willamette Valley was such an important hop grower at this region. They have the natural irrigation. Willamette Valley boosters and politicians touted hop production as a key part of economic and cultural life in the state. In 1898, an Oregon State Board of Agriculture publication explained that, quote, "The garden spot of the world for the cultivation of hops is the Willamette Valley, and the city of Salem sits in the center of the greatest hop district in the world." Every year, the large hop dealers of London and the eastern cities have their representatives occupying offices in Salem. So again, this is part of the transnational history. They were really feeding the English industry by the turn of the 20th century, the English beer industry, that is. Across the country in New York, an agricultural expert agreed, noting of the possible, quote, "monopoly of the world's hop market by the United States, and especially by our Pacific Coast states." And across the Atlantic, European experts also agreed. Emmanuel Gros, in 1900, a German expert, warned his readers that the introduction of hop growing in the Pacific Northwest marks, quote, "a turning point in the history of the industry, the consequences being adverse to the interests of European growers." So this was real. This wasn't just boosters promoting the hop capital of the world. This was folks around the world. And the numbers backed up these claims. In 1904, Oregon hop growers signed an exclusive contract with a brewery you probably have heard of in Ireland. Guinness Brewery. So by 1904, you're getting Oregon hops in Guinness beer, which is very cool. In 1905, Oregon cements itself as the largest hop producing state in the United States, a position it would hold until they have a tremendous disease outbreak in the mid-1940s. So really we're talking that Willamette Valley and Oregon are the center of the hop growing world for about 45 years. Now, I would be remiss to say, or if I didn't mention that Willamette Valley hop growers also have their share of problems. Pests and diseases made it pretty quickly after the 1860s and 1870s. Here we see a pre-industrial sprayer. They're probably spraying copper or what's really cool, they imported this bark of a South American tree. It's called the quassia tree. So they're importing bark from South America to spray their hops in hopes of getting rid of basically aphids and spider mites. There was also a huge problem in that hop growers struggled to acquire enough harvest labor. The West in the late 19th and early 20th century was a sparsely populated place, and as you could tell from these hop crops that grow, or even one plant growing up 12 or maybe 14 feet in the air with cones hanging all the way top to bottom, it takes a lot of people to pick those cones off individually. So growers had to get creative in who they hired to pick these hops, or they would leave the hops on the vine just to rot. And so harvest labor became a central concern, and many hop growers failed because of their inability to harvest, to acquire enough laborers. So, let's see, do I have an image? So Ezra Meeker, actually in that book, Hop Culture in the United States from the 1880s, he establishes a method early on in that he's going to employ American Indian pickers. And if you can read this, it's the text on the top and bottom says, Hopfield Puyallup Indian Camp. So he'd set up an entire Indian camp for to ensure that his hops would be picked. And over time, other growers in the Willamette Valley followed this lead, and they hired Chinese and Japanese, African American, later Mexican workers. So this became a multicultural affair in the hop yards as well. And I've written and talked about this in other places, but I'm not going to. I'll answer questions later, but I don't have too much more to say about that right now. This is a little later in the early 20th century. You can see cultural diversity in the hop picking. Many of you are familiar with the hop camps themselves, though. In late August or early September, entire families would go out to the hop farms. There's even a train that went from Portland to Independence. It was called the Hop Special. And they'd transport entire families. And the Independence Chamber of Commerce and the growers came together and they provided entertainment. And they wanted to provide, let's see, what did they had? Horse races and boxing matches and dances and a really festive feel, because the fact of the matter was, hop picking was not very fun. It wasn't. You would sit in the hot sun all day long and pick hop cones. But some images like these really play to what the growers wanted, which is to promote a festive feel. And of course, there's thousands of images like this. People either wrapped hops around them or sitting in hop baskets that they would use to put the crop in. So it's kind of a divided legacy, actually, of the tedious, unskilled labor versus the festive atmosphere. Now, there was one more issue that drove Oregon hop growers crazy. The perceived poor quality of their hops in marketplaces around the world. We have to remember one thing from the beginning, which is beer makers in the European tradition preferred European hop varieties. So they did not necessarily want hops grown in the Pacific Northwest. And so I look at the records and I find English hop merchants, for example, suggesting the quality of this produce is subpar. And I never quite understood what that meant. Sometimes it would mean there's in a bale of hops there's too many stems and leaves rather than there's just the pure cones. And it wasn't until a recent trip to England where I was researching the origins of the American hop industry that hop scientists explained to me what poor quality meant. And it's brilliant, and I'll explain why in a second. The terroir, or the soil and climatic conditions, the terroir is a term we use in viticulture or wine grape growing, right? The soil conditions produced hops in the Pacific Northwest that were too aromatic. They were too flavorful. They were too hoppy. They were too hoppy. And so English, if you think about a nice English bitter, it's not very hoppy, it's very malty, right? And so the Pacific Northwest growers got a reputation as having poor quality hops. And those are the hops we use today as part of the craft beer revolution, right? So that's a cool part of my recent research. I'm glad you got excited about that. Okay, what are the points to take home from this story of Hoptopia? It was my goal this evening to convince you that the contents of your pint glass have a much richer history than you might imagine.
Try the pills.
What's that?
Try the Pilsner.
Try the pills. You heard it here first. Or second. I think that's what he said. Try the pills? Or did he say? It was my goal this evening to convince you that the contents of your pint glass have a much richer history than you might imagine, and that the craft beer revolution was in part a product of a vast global agricultural history that passed through the Willamette Valley. And while there are many directions I could have taken this talk, I wanted to convince you of three important aspects of this history. So we're having a review like it's classroom time right now. I wanted to convince you first that the story of beer and hops begins with the land, with geology, with soil, with water, with climate. In other words, the Willamette Valley environment is an important actor in the story of Hoptopia. The region exceeded production levels early on because of these conditions, inspiring many farmers to plant rootstock. More recently, the story of terroir has been essential to growing strong hops in this region that is now catching on around the world, basically. Second, I wanted to emphasize that agricultural success can only be achieved if farmers have knowledge of the plants they grow. The knowledge, ranging from rootstock selection to harvest methods, developed over nearly 1,000 years. The product of a collective knowledge from Europe, transferred to the east coast of the United States, or of North America by the 1620s, and eventually across the continent, as people like Ezra Meeker then participated in that knowledge exchange with this hop culture in the United States. This is all to say that the notion of Hoptopia reflects a never-ending exchange of agricultural knowledge across the world. Third, I wanted to suggest that economy is essential in the story as well. The Pacific Northwest first generation of hop growers planted the crop not just to make brewers happy, but to test a new way of making a living, to make a lot of money, actually. Ezra Meeker's initial experiment proved lucrative, and others wanted to follow in his footsteps. Success expanded after the completion of the transcontinental railroads in the late 19th century and after the 1882 global hop crisis. Organizing to overcome pests and diseases, building appropriate facilities like hop dryers, and hiring enough harvest labor were also part of this economic success. So that's the quick story of how we might conceive of the Willamette Valley as Hoptopia. It's really just the opening chapter to this story. This was a lot of fun. Cheers to you all. And I think I'm going to have one more drink. Cheers. Any questions? The question is, how did Prohibition affect the hop growing industry in Oregon? This is chapter 3, which is, remember, Prohibition occurs at the state level as early as the first decade of the 20th century. So hop farmers in Oregon, because we have direct democracy here, are worried that we're going to vote on state prohibition earlier, right? Which they do. I think it's by 1914, whereas national prohibition doesn't start until 1920. So hop growers were afraid of prohibition all the way back by 1908, 1910. They're writing letters to senators and governors. And a lot of people pull their hops out of the land in fear of the loss of the domestic marketplace. But check this out. World War I emerges at the same time. And the agricultural lands of Bavaria, Bohemia, France are destroyed. So guess what? Europe needs a hop supplier. In the 1920s, the Oregon industry expands every year despite national prohibition because they're catering to the global hop economy. It just wasn't hops needed in Germany. This is a time when Oregon hop growers take over a Latin American marketplace that German dominated as well, and Asia. So it's a really it's a surprising answer, isn't it? And that's an interesting part of things. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So if I understand right, the German beer laws say beer is just made from like 2 or 3 things, hops, one of them, one, another, third. And then you hear about beer going back to Persia, someplace like 6,000, 8,000 years. So how is it the same process? I mean, it sounds so different than hop.
Beer is just malted grain. So you have a grain, mostly it's barley, or you'll have wheat or rye. And you just malt it so you get the syrupy sweetness of it. You add yeast. The yeast eats that sweetness and creates alcohol. So that's basically what beer is. And people, prior to the use of hops, they added cumin, St. John's wort, heather, dandelion, whatever they could. So there's different categorizations of beer. If you don't use hops in beer, some people call that root beer, which is a term you're probably familiar with. There's a whole issue in England about the difference between ale and beer, but over time, ale and beer become the same thing. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
So is there another use for the hops that they were growing besides beer? Like seeds and baking from earlier slides?
Mostly, no. Hops is associated with baking often because of the connection with yeast and beer making. Tim kind of talked about that a little bit. The key answer to that question is that hops have the lupulin is antibacterial. So people used hops as medicinals going back thousands of years. And I think even, this is just conjecture on my part, but I believe that even wild hops grown in North America, American Indians used the hop cones for medicinals. If you think about its sister plant, it's hemp. So you can use hop bine for twine as well. A lot of people put together hop pillows because they thought that it would help you breathe better. But today, 99.9% of hops are used in beer making.
And all that grown in the Willamette Valley would have been for beer making?
Yeah, it's for beer making. I mean, some people would take even back then it was probably 99, 98%. Yeah. You can also buy soap with hops in it too, of course. Yeah.
Like, how big is the hop industry?
Financially, I don't know. They vary between about 5,000 to 6,000 acres a year. In the peak year, 1935, there's 26,000 acres. To give you an idea, it's on the decline. And the reason for that is Anheuser-Busch, ultimately InBev, and these bigger companies, they're going to go where the hops are cheap. So they're looking to like China, and they're not, or other places, and they're not concerned about the quality of hops. What's really cool in the last 10 years in Oregon history is that Oregon hop growers have a turn to growing specific aroma varieties for craft beer. And I was meeting with a hop grower the other day, and I think that 50% of his crop was geared towards craft beer, which, as we all know, is less than 10% of the market share. So it's not huge in Oregon anymore, but it's huge for the craft beer movement. Does that make sense? Yeah.
How much of that goes outside the region, like back east? I mean, your craft brewers from Maine, California, Alaska, Florida. So
Yeah, a lot of them.
Export the steak export.
Yeah, so I can't remember if I mentioned this. Washington's 25% of the world market, Oregon's 5%, Idaho's 3% to make our third of the world market share. There's a lot of hop collectives, like Hop Union is a group of growers originally from Yakima Valley. They put their hops together and they market and sell them all over the place, not just in the region. But if you're looking for those good hoppy beers, or I'm sorry, if you're looking to make a good hoppy beer, then you're probably going to look to the quality hops grown in the Willamette Valley today. Yeah.
There was a hop crash. Can you explain that?
Yeah, in 2007 there was a hop crisis. These things are not always, this happens, it's a commodity. This is what happens in commodity markets, if they can crash and they go up and down. As a result of this hop crash, let's see if I can answer this in a different way. The big boys were okay. They had the big beer companies, they signed 4 or 5 year contracts, so they were the first ones to make sure they got their hops. The hop crash really screwed with craft brewers because they didn't have multi-year contracts. So the result of the hop crash in 2007 is quite interesting. Number one, craft brewers are now signing multi-year contracts with growers in the Willamette Valley. Number two, a lot of people are trying to grow their own hops. And you saw there's a Rogue Department of Agriculture now. Rogue purchased an old hop farm outside of Independence, Oregon to ensure that it has a somewhat stable hop supply. So that's my answer geared toward craft beer, I guess. Is that helpful? Logan?
If you have someone over the...
Yeah, sorry.
I was curious, what do you think hops tasted like 100 years ago?
Delicious. The question is, what did hops taste like 100 years ago? Well, there are different hops that they were growing. The main hops they were growing 100 years ago in Oregon were called Oregon clusters. They had some Canadian red vines, and they had also fuggles, right? And we still have fuggles in beer today. And those are English varieties, of course. How did they taste 100 years ago? Tim, when you interviewed that woman, the hops 100 years ago, we have a lot more variety now. There's a hop breeding program that started at Oregon State University in 1930. I've read all the records from those folks, and they were developing new hop varieties. One of their scientists named Al Honnold had his hand in developing 24 new hop varieties. So I would suggest today that we have more variety, and also we have a lot more aromatic and flavorful hop varieties in the marketplace.
More British or German rootstock? I mean, we talk about all this lager stuff. It's really were they making lager beer with British hops?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. That's a good point, which is why they got a bad name. Because they're mostly growing, if you think about England's climate and environment in northern France, maybe it's really similar to the Pacific Northwest. It's not similar to Bavaria and continental Europe. So they weren't using necessarily German hop varieties to brew their lager beer. So, is that what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Which is brilliant, yeah. So that was an issue for people trained in German traditions, absolutely.
So when you say Hoptopia, you're really talking about the Northwest, this Seattle, Washington, 25%, not the Valley, it's only 5%.
I use the term Hoptopia for several reasons as the title of my book. One of them is that the Willamette Valley has always been seen and written about as an agricultural Eden going back to the 1840s. They've had the most permanent hop supply and hop produce since 1867, and they were really the largest hop producers in the late 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. And then, of course, you have the craft beer movement in Beervana. So I'm kind of linking all of those ideas together. People from Washington can throw bricks at me and say, no, we are Hoptopia. And I will say, ouch.
Someone, you're right.
Yeah, just go ahead.
Hey, Peter, so...
Hi, Ben.
Yes. You said the unique kind of agricultural circumstances and climate of this region were particularly great for hops. I'm just curious, have you noticed issues with climate change or recent agriculture climate factors that might be indicating there's a change there?
Answering this question feels a lot different in Portland than it does in southern New Mexico. Yeah, it's going to change things. I mean, I don't think we've thought about it. At a talk I gave 3 years ago, Fred Eckert, the famous beer writer, suggested, he says, why aren't people growing hops in eastern Oregon? For similar reasons that they're growing in the Yakima Valley. Maybe it's more arid and they have good irrigation. I don't know. The short answer to that, Ben, is that, yeah, climate change is going to affect hop growing. And we don't know what that means. It's kind of like to be continued, I guess. It's a good point. Is that it?
Hold on.
Oh, one more. Yeah, fire away.
So, having grown up in southeastern Virginia, I immediately saw parallels of hops to tobacco as a luxury crop, and one that was picked by migrant workers and differing people of certain ethnicities. Do you see any particular parallels in your research between those two crops?
You're making me think, man. The question is there a connection to the tobacco industry, which is an industry of vice, and the hop industry, which is also associated with the industry of vice? Is that fair to say that's what you're asking?
I think so.
And then the connection of labor. I think generally in the history of American agriculture, migrant labor has been essential to the ability to harvest crops and so on and so forth. I will say, I'm racking my brain because there was a specific connection I was thinking of. I can't come up with it right now. But generally, migrant labor harvests crops or lower classes or slaves in the case of tobacco going back to a couple hundred years ago. I will say that in Oregon, a lot of the people that harvested crops, and a number I didn't give you that's quite amazing, is that in the Willamette Valley in the 1930s, there was 60 or 70,000 people needed to harvest the crops, which if you look at the census records is something like 1/10 of the state's population. So they hired all across the classes, all races, ethnicities, middle class, lower class, so on and so forth. And a lot of people didn't even know what hops did or what they were doing. They just knew that it would help make money and maybe be a little festival for a few weeks. So I don't have a good answer to your question, but it allowed me to bring up another point I wanted to bring up. Cheers. Thanks, everybody. This was fun.